Hello everybody, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, host of Reformed GGA, and this is hopefully going to be a relatively quick public service announcement for people who own CZ Scorpions so that they can be aware of an issue that I had recently. Some time ago, a couple of weeks back maybe now, but some time ago I went out shooting my CZ Scorpions as I often do. And one of the CZs that I brought out, I only have two, but one of them that I brought out was my little FDE one here, my little pistol. And I had a very, very interesting malfunction with it. Now, this particular pistol has had malfunctions before. I've been able to track down the cause of those malfunctions, and the vast majority of the malfunctions that it has had up until this point have either been the result of poorly made magazines, incorrectly made magazines. Some of the early Magpul magazines turned out that they were made a little bit wrong. I think they've corrected the problem since then, but some of the early Magpul magazines were made incorrectly, and it resulted in some stovepiping issues, and so I don't use the old Magpul magazines in the gun anymore. And then also, like with almost every gun that is out there, CZ Scorpions will sometimes malfunction when you bump fire them. So you happen to get an out-of-spec magazine, you bump fire it, yeah, weird crazy things can happen, but other than that, CZ Scorpions are normally very reliable. And when they do malfunction, it's usually fairly simple, straightforward stuff. But a while ago, not that long ago, like I said, within the past 3 weeks or so, I had a malfunction with this gun that wound up resulting in a copper ring forming in the chamber. And I actually was able to extract that copper ring and produce it for you guys here. But yeah, this got caught in the chamber of the gun, and you can see the edge of it that is bent out there. There's part of it that was stuck in the barrel, and then the wider part of it was the part that was in the chamber. And this actually was on the back of a bullet. This is the copper jacket from a bullet, and the front of the bullet, the pressure built up enough that it basically just sheared off of the gun. Sorry, not off the gun, but it just sheared off of the little rim here at the back. But this rim here in the back got caught inside of the chamber, and so it didn't go forward with the rest of the bullet. And that is a really weird thing to happen with pretty much any gun, but it made me wonder what exactly happened in this particular case. And what happened here that resulted in this malfunction was kind of the perfect storm of weird things. It's things that you could blame justly on the gun. There's a particular problem that CZ Scorpions have had pretty much ever since their inception into the American civilian market and their semi-auto mode, and I'll talk about that. There's also a particular brand of ammunition that is at play here, and it is the Winchester White Box NATO. And the NATO bullets, well, actually most of the Winchester White Box 9mm bullets are formed in have kind of a weird bullet shape that wound up contributing to this a ring being formed in the process of firing. So is it a gun problem? Is it an ammunition problem? Is it a user-caused malfunction? The answer to all those questions is kind of yes. As to the mechanical problems with the CZ Scorpion, the CZ Scorpion is capable of firing out of battery. And a lot of guns can technically be fired out of battery in that the bolt doesn't have to be all the way forward and you can pull the trigger and the hammer will fall. On a lot of guns, though, that's not a big deal because the geometry of the bolt is such that the hammer, when it falls, unless the bolt is all the way forward, the hammer can't actually fall square. If the bolt is too far back, the hammer can't actually get all the way up and slap forward. And so in most guns, even though you can technically fire them when the bolt is all the way in battery, the bolt geometry is such that that's not a big deal. In the CZ Scorpion, though, the bolt actually sits pretty far forward of the hammer, So when the bolt is forward, hammer can come and slap it pretty good. But even if the bolt is a good way back, the hammer can still get a good slap on the back of the bolt and hit the firing pin. And that can result in some major problems, and some major problems that have been known for a while. If you look up, CZ Scorpion explodes or something like that online, you'll see pictures of, a CZ Scorpion or former CZ Scorpion where the sides have just blown out to the sides. And there's even at least one video that I saw, maybe there's more, but at least one video that I saw of a CZ Scorpion being fired in full auto where same thing happened. The sides of the gun just gave way, and that was pretty much all she wrote. That out-of-battery firing problem has been known, but most CZ Scorpion owners don't worry about it just because of the nature of the problem. You say firing out of battery, that's a pretty significant issue. Well, let's keep this in context. There are something like 40,000 some odd CZ Scorpion Evo3s out there in either the full auto form or the semi-auto form, a good many of them being in the semi-auto form. And the only ones that have been reported to have this issue of catastrophically blowing up are the civilian ones. And it's because the civilian ones are capable of firing out of battery, whereas the military ones, the full auto capable ones, the select fire ones, are not. And the select fire ones, there's actually a special mechanism in there that keeps the hammer from falling unless the bolt is all the way forward. As I understand it, the ATF, when the decision to import the CZ Scorpion was being made, the ATF decided that that was part of the select fire mechanism, and therefore didn't allow it to be put on the semi-auto guns for civilians. So the ATF actually made the gun less safe. But like I said, most CZ Scorpion owners don't worry about it. Like I said, there's something like 40,000 CZ Scorpions out there, and there's only a handful of people that have had their CZ Scorpion blow up on them. And what it comes down to is kind of the way that 9mm rounds can work, and that is that the line between an out-of-battery detonation and an unsupported chamber detonation in 9mm is kind of a fine line. For example, in the Glocks, the earlier 9mm Glocks especially, I think they've changed it in the recent generation, or maybe the past couple of generations, but certainly in the early 9mm Glocks, the back of the 9mm round was not fully seated in the chamber. The chambers were not, frankly, as deep as most other chambers on 9mm guns were, and so the back of the casing was left further out than it would normally be. And this did result in a certain amount of bulging of those casings when they were pulled out, but that was usually all that would happen, is the case would bulge a little bit, the round would still go down range, and everything would be okay. And that tends to be the case with 9mm brass ammunition. As long as you don't have a very powerful charge and you have decent in-spec 9mm brass, it can actually handle being exposed a little bit. And when it comes to the CZ Scorpion, yes, it can fire out of battery, but it's usually not by enough to create major issues. And then the next question that comes up is, well, what about the people whose guns blew up? It was because of an out-of-battery discharge, wasn't it? Kind of. You do some more digging on them, and some of them, they just don't have any information. There's a picture of a blown up CZ Scorpion, or there's a video of a CZ Scorpion blowing up, but you don't have any further details, and there's not much to go on. In those cases where you do have details that you can go on, ammunition selection winds up being a key issue. In the verified cases that I know of where they actually know what kind of ammunition was being used and whatnot, it was aluminum case ammunition that wound up resulting in the out-of-battery detonation. Like I said, a brass case 9mm round, as long as it's decent quality brass and you don't have an overpressure round, 9mm can take kind of being out of battery, being unsupported, like the early Glocks had unsupported chambers, basically, or moderately supported chambers, I guess you could say. 9mm can withstand that to a certain extent if the casing is fairly strong, and most 2-spec brass 9mm casings can take that, but the aluminum casings that some places use to make the ammunition a little bit more cheaply, that's the advantage of using an aluminum casing, is that it makes the ammo cheaper to manufacture because aluminum casings aren't as expensive to make as brass casings are. The problem is that the aluminum casings don't deal with those kinds of pressures as well. And so if you have an unsupported aluminum casing, and especially if that round happens to be a little bit overpressured for some reason, either it was specifically made to be overpressured, like a plus P round or something like that, or the ammo manufacturer just simply put a little bit too much powder into that particular cartridge, which happens. Ammunition manufacturing has come a long way, but it is still not perfect. People still make mistakes, and you do still sometimes get overcharges. And if there's an overcharge with the bolt not being all the way forward in a CZ Scorpion, yeah, you're going to get an out-of-battery detonation, and it could very likely result in problems. And it's a matter of what the powder charge is, and it's a matter of how strong the case material is. And so in those cases where an out-of-battery detonation has been verified that it actually blew up the gun, all the ones that I'm aware of happened with aluminum case ammunition. And because of that, I don't shoot aluminum case ammunition through my CZ Scorpions, at least not anymore. I admit that in the past I've had some aluminum case ammunition and I've run it through the CZ Scorpion and it functioned just fine. I wasn't necessarily trying to shoot super fast or anything like that. That's usually when out-of-battery detonations happen, is when the hammer falls a little too quick before the bolts has fully come home. Never had any problems with it that way, but that was also before I delved into the issue of the guns exploding. I figured, it's just weird quality control issue, few guns, and statistically it is very small. Literally just a handful of guns that are out there, less than a dozen that I've actually been able to meaningfully verify. I mean, there's pictures that float around, but a lot of those are pictures of the same incident. As far as actual incidents that have happened, that have been recorded, that are documented, like I said, there's definitely no more than a dozen. And in terms of ones that actually have enough surrounding material so that you can actually figure out what happened, there's not many. There's like 1, 2, maybe 3 where you have enough surrounding information to get enough details to actually figure out what happened. And in the case where you do have those extra details, the common element is generally either aluminum case ammunition or ammunition that is otherwise out of spec. So yes, CZ Scorpions are technically capable of firing out of battery, and they can explode on you if that happens with a case that is weak enough that it doesn't contain the blast sufficiently. My experience is that most decent quality brass case rounds don't do that. They're just fine. But like I said, I had this ring get stuck in the chamber. And I mentioned that, this isn't an issue that can be attributed to only the gun or only the ammo or only the user. And I want to talk about the user issue here for a second. And that is that when I clean my CZ Scorpions, honestly, I'm not overly picky about it getting it super clean. And I have been in the habit of using my bore snake maybe more times than I should between times where I clean out the bore snake. And by the way, the shelf life on a bore snake is not indefinite, and you cannot use it multiple cleanings and expect it to do just as good the first time as on the last time. In my experience, you should probably clean the bore snake, every 2 to 3 guns, depending on how dirty the guns are. Maybe 4 guns if they're fairly small guns, and depending on the action type. But sometimes, honestly, I push it and it becomes more like 8 cleanings or something like that, in which case there's a lot of dirt and grime that'll build up on it, and you wind up leaving a lot of material in the chamber. And when you have material that gets built up in the chamber, that can mess with things, and it can keep a bullet from, say, being fully seated. And it can also, depending on where that material gets clogged up, sometimes it kind of starts in the chamber, and as you're shooting, it'll actually work into the barrel. And if you get enough material clogging up the barrel, you can basically wind up with a pipe bomb, especially in higher pressure guns. But in a lower pressure gun, like a pistol caliber gun like I have, and the CZ Scorpion, you can wind up with a squib load where the bullet basically doesn't want to go down the barrel like it's supposed to. It gets caught up in the barrel. And at the time that this happened, I had not cleaned the bore snake out as often as I should have, and so there was a lot of debris that was left in the chamber and barrel that I really shouldn't have allowed in there, but I did. And yes, that problem has been since remedied, and now I very meticulously clean my bore snakes. Every time I get done cleaning, the bore snake gets cleaned. So there was that, and that contributes to the problem. But then there's also the ammunition itself. The ammunition, like I said, was this Winchester White Box NATO spec ammunition, and the bullets have a very curious shape. You can see the diagram here that they provide, which is handy for this demonstration. The back of the bullet actually has a cavity in it. It's almost kind of like a hollow point, but it's on the opposite end of the bullet. And these bullets, like a lot of cheap leaking ammunition that are out there, only has a copper jacket around the front and outside, but nothing on the back. And these ones on the back of it actually has a little cavity that's there. And so if you get a situation where either the cartridge is not able to go all the way into the chamber because of debris and whatnot, or because it's still in the loading process and the hammer falls before it's fully loaded, but for whatever reason it's not into the chamber all the way, and the pressure hasn't built up enough to send the bullets through the barrel yet, and this is something that surprises some people, but when the gun goes off, the pressure actually takes some time to build. It's, a split second for us in the course of firing it, but it's still not technically instantaneous. There's still a very small fraction of a second from the time that the powder charge goes off to the time that enough pressure has been built for the bullet to be pushed down the barrel successfully. I mean, it's tiny, 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 but there can be a delay. And if the brass is not all the way up into the chamber like it's supposed to be, you can have the bullet being pushed out of the brass but not quite into the chamber yet. And sometimes the bullet will get kind of cattywampus because the chamber is technically a little bit bigger than the barrel. And usually it doesn't result in a squib load, but it'll get kind of stuck for a little bit until the pressure builds. It'll pause there for a little bit. And the problem with this particular bullet design that Winchester uses is that cavity on the back basically acts like a hollow point at that point, and it opens up because of all the pressure behind it that's trying to force the bullet down. Well, the bullet had to jump a gap that it's not supposed to jump, gets kind of caught a little bit weirdly. Pressure has to build to send it all the way down, and in the meantime, that cavity can get opened up, and that's exactly what happened on this one. So the reason why it has such a nice perfectly formed rim around it is because that's where the difference between the chamber and the barrel was. This is the back of the bullet, and the back of the bullet was right there at the edge. Force is coming behind it. It doesn't quite have enough force to send it through the barrel yet, but force is coming behind it, shoves it open, and frankly it's not all that hard to do. The copper jacket on these things is very thin, and then of course because it has that cavity back there, there's also not a lot of lead there. There's not much resistance, so it opens it up, formed it pretty much perfectly to the chamber, and then once the pressure had built enough, eventually it sent the bullet down the barrel, or at least the front end of the bullet. The back end of the bullet, this little rim here, stayed in the chamber, but that's what happened. And then after this one fired, the next round that came in tried to go into the chamber, and it was stuck outside of the chamber because it couldn't fully seat. It went into the chamber and it got stopped by this little copper ring that was in there, and it couldn't go in all the way, and it was far enough back that I couldn't get a detonation off of it, and nothing happened except that the gun stopped up and wouldn't go into battery, and so had to put a rod through the barrel and knock the little ring out, and once I did that, the gun went back to functioning just fine. But still a very weird, bizarre kind of malfunction. Didn't prove to be catastrophic, and the main reason why it didn't prove to be catastrophic is because these Winchester NATO rounds, the brass on them is good quality brass. And because of that, even though it obviously fired out of battery, otherwise this copper could not have gotten into the chamber like it did, because normally the brass would fill the chamber. This obviously was an out of battery detonation, but the brass on these rounds is good, and so it contained the explosion with and was actually able to sustain enough force to lead to the bullet basically breaking in two. The main mass of the bullet went down the barrel. It didn't form a squid load or anything like that. It actually went down the barrel and, impacted downrange just like a bullet is supposed to. Not quite in the same place as the other rounds, because it was obviously disformed by the time it got done doing its thing here, but had enough force to, deal with basically breaking the jacket of the bullet off the back end and still send it downrange. And that's basically what saved it. That's the nice thing about these rounds, is that they are built to take fairly high pressures, because their NATO spec is about 10 to 15% higher than standard pressure for a 9mm round. And so these things are built tough, and the casing took it just fine. But at the same time, because of that weird bullet design with that little cavity in the back, it wound up producing the problem in the first place. And like I said, the chamber wasn't as clean as it should have been, and that probably led to a delay in the bullet going down the barrel as well. And like I said, the gun can fire out of battery, and so this was the kind of the perfect storm of issues that created this problem. And it's just one of those things that I wouldn't normally have expected with a CZ Scorpion, because normally CZ Scorpions do just fine as long as you have brass ammunition in them or some kind of casing that's stronger than aluminum. They also tend to function just fine with most steel case ammunition, because most steel case ammunition in 9mm is pretty strong. Yes, if you have a fairly long, straight-walled cartridge, steel casings will a lot of times split and crack, but that doesn't tend to be the case with 9mm. 9mm steel casings are usually just fine. And like I said, a NATO spec brass casing is also just fine. But it is something that I wanted people to be aware of. Now, when this malfunction happened, I was bump firing the gun, and that's why the hammer fell before the bolt had come home. I was firing very quickly. That's what bump firing does, and sometimes the timing of the different pieces doesn't work out quite right. And part of it is because the gun allows for that, and then also part of it is just because bump firing is not an overly precise process anyways, and weird things can happen. So kind of the perfect storm of issues. If I hadn't been bump firing, probably wouldn't have happened. If it had been on a different gun that couldn't fire out of battery, or like I said, technically most guns you can drop the hammer out of battery, but it won't actually hit the hammer, the firing pin, because of the geometry that they have. If you hit it out of battery, the hammer doesn't come all the way forward. CZ Scorpion it does, because the hammer's far enough back. So a lot of other guns just simply wouldn't be an issue, and even if the chamber's dirty on a lot of other guns, because of the geometry, it wouldn't be an issue. All those kinds of things. And I'm not at all saying that the Winchester NATO spec ammunition is bad ammunition. It's not. It's just the wrong combination for the situation. And I just wanted to make people aware of it. If you use those Winchester rounds, both the NATO ammunition and a lot of their common plinking ammunition still has that hollow cavity on the back end. And if you plan on firing your CZ Scorpion as fast as you can, bump firing or not, then there is a chance that you could get this weird little ring malfunction in there, and depending on how thick of a ring forms, it could be followed up by another out-of-battery detonation, and if that other out-of-battery detonation happens far enough back, then it could lead to a catastrophic malfunction where the gun explodes on you. In my case, that didn't happen, and like I said, the casings that were used on this particular ammunition is pretty tough, because it survived the initial out-of-battery detonation and contained it. The gun didn't explode on me or anything like that. So good that way, but I just want people to be aware that that is a potential issue, and also aware of what caused it. It's a combination of the fact that the gun can fire out of battery. It was also exacerbated by the fact that I had not cleaned the chamber area properly like I should have, and then you combine that with a round that basically has a hollow cavity on the backside that could expand in the chamber if it's allowed to fire in the chamber. And yeah, you're going to have a recipe for a potentially catastrophic malfunction. Solution to that is fairly simple. Don't fire the gun too quick. And I've mentioned this in other videos before that I'm not a big fan of people who go out and get the light triggers for the CZ Scorpions. I know why they do it. It makes the gun a lot more fun, a lot easier to fire and all those kinds of things. But the faster you are on the trigger, the more likely you are to drop the hammer before the bolt has come home, the more likely you are to get a problem. And then if you do insist on firing the gun quick, you really like your light trigger spring, you like to bump fire, I'm guilty of liking to bump fire, then reconsider what ammo you bump fire with. I'm not going to tell you what to do with your gun. Personally, I would say that bump firing a CZ Scorpion until they finally fix the outer battery issue is probably not the safest thing to be doing. But if you are going to do it, at least be smart about the ammunition that you pick. And ammunition that has a little hollow point in the back of the bullet is really not a good idea for a gun that is capable of firing out of battery. Like I said, these guns do it actually fairly often, a lot more often than you might think, but very, very, very few of them have ever catastrophically detonated, and it's because a good 9mm casing can usually handle being unsupported to a certain extent. I mean, Glock figured this out a long time ago, and it annoys reloaders to death because once the cases become distended in that way, you can't really, or at least really shouldn't, reload them and rely on them as reloads. But for the first time through, it's usually just fine. And CZ Scorpions basically act like that with ammunition that has good casing. So stay away from the aluminum stuff. Stay away from the ultra bulk pack cheapo stuff that is out there. And now, adding to the list of things that you should not do with your CZ Scorpion, don't use bullets that have little hollow cavities in the back, because with a gun that can fire out of battery, that's a recipe for disaster that's just waiting to happen. Now, like I said, if you slow down, fire the gun slowly, wait for it to come fully into battery before firing off the next round, you're probably not going to notice it. And frankly, I plan on shooting the Winchester NATO through the gun because I happen to like the particular round and how it performs in the gun. But not going to be the round that I use for bump firing. It's not going to be my speed drill round. It's going to have other uses. So take that for what it's worth, but I just wanted you guys to be appraised of the issue and aware of the potential dangers there, and realize that this was kind of a combination of things that led to this particular very odd malfunction. This is not indicative of all CZ Scorpions, and like I said, it is a combination of things. It's the wrong bullet design for the wrong gun design for the wrong level of maintenance, and that's what created this problem. If you fix each one of those, you don't have an issue at all. But even if you fix just one of those three issues, you're not likely to have the problem. Don't use the ammo that has a little cavity on the back. Fixes that. Make sure that you properly, meticulously clean out the chambers so that there's nothing that would keep the round from going fully into battery. And it would be really super great if CZ would put some kind of an in-battery safety into their guns like they have in the full auto versions. Obviously the ATF doesn't like that particular device, but if they could come up with something else, that would be really awesome and really, really, really appreciated, because everything else about the gun is fantastic. But the fact that it fires out of battery does limit what you can do in the gun in terms of ammunition. Aluminum case ammunition is out, and now all of the Winchester stuff that has this hollow point stuff on the back is also out in terms of being able to fire the gun quickly. Like I said, if you sit there and you wait and you make sure that the bolt is fully closed, I don't think it's going to be a problem. But honestly, a lot of us like to go fast. And for those of us who like to go fast, aluminum case ammunition is a no-go. And now the Winchester stuff with those weird hollow cavities on the back, they're also no-goes now. Okay, that's my assessment. Thank you all for your time and attention. Bye-bye.